I was scrolling through social media when I saw the photos. My ex-husband Marcus lounging on a Hamptons beach with Veronica, his former secretary, her engagement ring glinting in the summer sun just 3 months after our divorce was finalized. I felt sick, humiliated, betrayed all over again. But 2 weeks later, his mother's attorney called me with news about her will, and suddenly Marcus's triumphant smile didn't seem quite so permanent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Diana Castellano, and until 18 months ago, I believed I had built the perfect life. At 41 years old, I was a senior marketing director at a prestigious pharmaceutical company in Manhattan, living in a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, married to a man I had loved since graduate school. Marcus Castellano had been my partner for 17 years, my husband for 14 of those years, and the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world. I should have known something was deeply wrong much earlier than I did. Looking back now, with the clarity that only hindsight and devastating betrayal can provide, I can see the signs that I willfully ignored or rationalized away. The late nights at the office that became more frequent over the past 3 years. The business trips that seemed to multiply, taking him away for long weekends to conferences I never quite understood the necessity of attending. The way he stopped asking about my day, stopped engaging with the details of my work challenges or celebrating my professional victories. But the human capacity for self-deception is remarkable, particularly when confronting the truth would mean dismantling everything you have built your identity around. I told myself that Marcus was simply focused on growing his commercial real estate development firm, that his distraction was the natural consequence of ambition and professional pressure, that the cooling of our intimacy was just a phase that long-married couples inevitably experienced. The truth, as I would eventually discover, was far more brutal and far more cliched than I could have imagined. The beginning of the end arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October. I had left work early, something I rarely did, because I had been fighting a migraine all afternoon and finally admitted to myself that I would be more productive at home after some rest than forcing myself to sit through another meeting while my vision blurred at the edges. I took the subway back to Brooklyn, picked up Thai food from our favorite restaurant, and let myself into our brownstone around 6 in the evening. The house was dark and quiet. Marcus typically did not return home until 8 or 9 on weeknights, sometimes even later. I set the takeout containers on the kitchen counter, took 2 ibuprofen with a large glass of water, and headed upstairs to change into comfortable clothes. As I passed Marcus's home office, I noticed the door was slightly ajar and his laptop was open on the desk, the screen still glowing. Marcus was meticulous about his office space and obsessive about security. He never left his laptop open and unattended. Never. The deviation from his normal behavior caught my attention immediately, triggering some instinct I had been suppressing for months. I should have simply closed the laptop and walked away. I should have respected his privacy the way I would have wanted mine respected. But something in me, some part that had been noticing the signs and refusing to consciously acknowledge them, moved me forward into his office. I sat down at his desk and looked at the screen. An email was open, part of a thread that had clearly been ongoing for some time. The sender was identified simply as V, and the preview of messages visible on the screen contained language that no employee should be using with her employer, language that made the nature of their relationship immediately and horrifyingly clear. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the email thread, my migraine forgotten in the flood of adrenaline that accompanied each new revelation. The correspondence dated back almost 3 years, beginning with professional exchanges about scheduling and client meetings, gradually shifting into more personal territory over months, until the messages became unmistakably intimate. Declarations of love. Explicit descriptions of encounters in hotel rooms during business trips. Planning for a future together once Marcus figured out how to handle the complication of his marriage. The complication of his marriage. That was how he had referred to me, to our 14 years together, to the life we had built. A complication to be managed and eventually resolved. I do not remember making the conscious decision to search deeper, but I found myself opening his documents folder, clicking through files with shaking hands. A folder labeled Personal Planning contained documents that revealed the full scope of his betrayal and his intentions. A draft separation agreement that proposed terms heavily favorable to Marcus, suggesting I would receive far less than half of our marital assets. Financial documents showing accounts I had never known existed. Money systematically moved out of our joint holdings into accounts in only his name. A timeline for filing for divorce, with notes about strategy and optimal timing. He had been planning this for at least 18 months. While I had been working long hours to support our household income, celebrating what I thought were his business successes, planning vacations we never seemed to actually take, he had been methodically preparing to leave me and ensuring he would do so with maximum financial benefit to himself. The woman V was Veronica Chen. She had started as his executive assistant 4 years ago. Young and ambitious and apparently willing to become involved with her married employer. The email threads revealed that Marcus had promised her repeatedly that he would divorce me once his business reached certain financial milestones, once his company went public, once the timing was optimal. He had been stringing her along almost as long as he had been deceiving me. I sat in his office as darkness fell outside, reading through years of lies, my entire understanding of my life and my marriage disintegrating with each new document. The man I had loved, had supported through the early struggling years of his business, had sacrificed my own career advancement for when his company needed more attention, had been living a completely separate life. He had been sharing intimate details of that other life with a woman barely 30 years old while maintaining the facade of our marriage for what appeared to be purely financial and social benefit. When I finally heard his key in the front door around 9 that evening, I had moved through shock and pain into a cold, clarifying rage. I remained seated at his desk, his laptop open in front of me, and waited. I heard him call out a greeting, heard him move through the downstairs, heard his footsteps on the stairs. When he appeared in the doorway of his office and saw me sitting at his desk, the color drained from his face. Marcus Castellano was 43 years old, handsome in a polished way that had intensified as his wealth increased. Expensive haircuts, custom suits, a gym-sculpted physique maintained through early morning workouts with a personal trainer. He looked every inch the successful Manhattan businessman, and in that moment when he saw me at his computer, I watched him make rapid calculations about how to handle the situation. He chose to go on the offensive rather than apologizing or attempting explanation. "Diana, what are you doing going through my private correspondence? That's a complete violation of my privacy and my business confidentiality." His indignation would have been impressive if it had not been so absurd given what I had just discovered. I looked at him calmly, surprised by how steady my voice emerged. "How long have you been sleeping with your secretary, Marcus?" He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before shifting tactics. "Her title is executive assistant. And I don't know what you think you've found, but you're misinterpreting professional correspondence. Veronica and I work very closely together on complex deals. The communication can sometimes seem more personal than it is, but it's purely professional." I had anticipated this response. I clicked to open one of the more explicitly sexual email exchanges and turned the laptop screen toward him. "Is this your idea of professional communication? Because I'm quite certain that describing what you want to do to her body in a hotel room falls outside normal business discourse." His jaw tightened, and I saw the exact moment when he abandoned the denial strategy and decided to embrace a different approach. He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, his body language shifting from defensive to coldly businesslike. "Fine. Yes, Veronica and I are involved. We have been for some time. I was planning to discuss this with you in a more controlled manner, but since you've chosen to invade my privacy, we can have this conversation now. Diana, our marriage has been over for years. You know it, I know it. We've been going through the motions, maintaining appearances. It's time we both acknowledged reality and moved on with our lives." The casual cruelty of his words, the way he attempted to rewrite our history to justify his betrayal, ignited something fierce inside me. "Our marriage was over for years? That's fascinating, Marcus, because I was under the impression I was still very much invested in our relationship. Perhaps you're confusing my devotion with your own checked-out status." He sighed with theatrical patience, as though I were being deliberately obtuse. "You've been devoted to your career, Diana. Let's be honest. How many evenings have you worked late? How many weekends have you been on your laptop dealing with work issues? We stopped being a priority for each other a long time ago." The attempt to distribute blame equally was predictable but still infuriating. I worked late to contribute to our household income while you were building your business. I supported your career ambitions, even when it meant sacrificing opportunities for my own advancement. And apparently while I was doing that, you were planning how to leave me with as little as possible from the assets we built together. His expression hardened. I built that business, Diana. My vision, my work, my risk-taking. You had a steady corporate job with a regular paycheck. Don't pretend you were some kind of sacrificial spouse carrying me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There it was, the fundamental disrespect that had apparently been underlying his attitude for years. My corporate career was just a job, while his entrepreneurial ventures were important work. My steady income that had paid our mortgage and living expenses while his business was unprofitable for the first 5 years was just a regular paycheck, not worthy of acknowledgement or appreciation. I stood up from his desk, closing the laptop carefully. I want you out of this house tonight. Go stay with Veronica, since you've apparently already been maintaining that relationship for years. My attorney will contact you tomorrow to begin divorce proceedings. Marcus actually laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. Your attorney? Diana, I've had attorneys working on this for over a year. I'm several steps ahead of you. And for your information, this house is not community property in the way you might think. The down payment came from my family money. The mortgage payments were made primarily from my business income. You're going to find that your claims on our assets are far more limited than you imagine. He delivered this information with evident satisfaction, clearly enjoying having planned so thoroughly for this confrontation. What he did not know, what I would not discover for another several weeks, was that his meticulous planning had one fatal flaw. His mother, Sofia Castellano, had been far more observant about her son's character than he realized, and far more principled about justice than he had ever given her credit for. But in that moment, standing in his office with my marriage exploding around me, I had no knowledge of what was coming. I only knew that I needed to be smart, strategic, and absolutely relentless in protecting myself from a man who had revealed himself to be far more ruthless than I had understood. Marcus did leave that night, though not before making several more attempts to control the narrative and convince me that his version of events was reasonable. He portrayed himself as a man who had simply fallen in love with someone else after his marriage had naturally run its course, as though the years of deliberate deception and financial maneuvering were just practical responses to an unfortunate situation rather than calculated betrayal. After he left, I sat in our living room, in the brownstone we had purchased together 8 years ago, and tried to process the complete dissolution of everything I had believed about my life. I had thought Marcus and I were partners. I had thought we were building something together, that we shared values and goals, that we had the kind of solid foundation that would carry us through the normal challenges of long-term marriage. Instead, I had been living with a stranger, someone capable of sustained deception on a scale that suggested either sociopathic lack of empathy or such profound selfishness that it amounted to the same thing. The man I had loved, had been intimate with, had planned a future with, had never actually existed. He had been a performance, a character Marcus played when it suited his purposes, discarded when maintaining the pretense became inconvenient. The next morning I called in sick to work and began making phone calls. I contacted the most aggressive divorce attorney in Manhattan, a woman named Rachel Weinstein who had a reputation for absolutely destroying opposing counsel and securing maximum possible assets for her clients. I scheduled an emergency appointment for that afternoon and spent the morning documenting everything I could remember about our finances, our assets, and the timeline of Marcus's deception. Rachel Weinstein turned out to be exactly as advertised. Sharp, ruthless, and immediately strategic. She was in her early 50s, dressed in an immaculate suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, with steel gray hair cut in a severe bob and dark eyes that assessed me with clinical precision as I told her my story. "You did the right thing documenting everything immediately," she said after I had finished my narrative. "And the fact that he admitted the affair directly to you, plus the email evidence you've preserved, gives us strong leverage. However, I need to be honest with you about what you're facing. Your husband clearly has sophisticated legal advice, and the fact that he's been planning this for 18 months means he's had time to structure assets in ways that may limit your claims." She paused, making notes on a legal pad with swift, precise handwriting. The house situation is more complex than he suggested, though. Regardless of the down payment source, if marital funds were used for mortgage payments and improvements over 8 years, you have legitimate claims to equity. And his attempt to move assets out of joint accounts may actually work in your favor, as courts take a very dim view of dissipation of marital assets in anticipation of divorce. I felt a small measure of relief at this information. So he can't just take everything he's been planning to take? Rachel looked at me with an expression that might have been sympathy if her professional demeanor allowed for such softness. He can try. And he will try based on what you've told me. But we're going to fight him on every single asset, every single account, every single claim. This will not be pleasant, Diana. Contested divorces with significant assets involved rarely are. Your husband will likely attempt to paint you as a neglectful spouse, as someone who prioritized career over marriage, as having contributed minimally to his business success. We'll need to be prepared to counter all of that with documentation of your actual contributions and his actual deceptions. Thus began the most grueling 6 months of my life. Marcus did exactly what Rachel predicted, hiring an aggressive legal team that immediately went on the offensive. They filed countermotions to everything Rachel submitted. They demanded extensive financial discovery from me, while simultaneously claiming that many of Marcus's business records were proprietary and couldn't be fully disclosed. They attempted to schedule depositions at times they knew would conflict with my work obligations, trying to make me choose between my career and my divorce proceedings. The strategy was clearly to exhaust me financially and emotionally, to make continuing the fight so costly and unpleasant that I would eventually accept whatever settlement they offered just to make it stop. What Marcus and his attorneys did not anticipate was my capacity for sustained rage-fueled determination. Every attempt to intimidate or exhaust me only hardened my resolve to ensure he did not get away with his calculated betrayal. During this period, I continued working at my demanding corporate job, managing major marketing campaigns while simultaneously dealing with lawyer calls, document requests, and the emotional toll of having my entire marriage dissected and evaluated by attorneys and forensic accountants. My colleagues noticed I had become more focused and harder-edged, but I offered no explanations beyond mentioning I was going through a divorce. I had no interest in being the object of office sympathy or gossip. Marcus, meanwhile, made no attempt to be discreet about his relationship with Veronica. Within weeks of our separation, he was openly bringing her to business events and social functions, introducing her as his partner. The brazenness was clearly intentional, another strategy to humiliate me into accepting a quick settlement rather than enduring the public spectacle of his very visible new relationship. The Hamptons Beach incident occurred in early July, about 4 months into our separation and 2 months after I had filed for divorce. I was not on social media frequently, preferring to avoid the performance of curated perfection that platforms like Instagram demanded. But a well-meaning friend sent me a screenshot with a message asking if I was okay, and I found myself looking at photos that Marcus had clearly wanted to be very public. The images showed Marcus and Veronica on a beach in the Hamptons, specifically at a private beach club that catered to wealthy Manhattan professionals. They were photographed in several poses that managed to be both intimate and carefully staged. Veronica in a designer bikini, Marcus in expensive swim trunks, both of them tanned and fit and radiating the kind of aggressive happiness that seemed designed to communicate victory. In the clearest photo, Veronica's left hand was prominently displayed, a massive engagement ring catching the sunlight. The caption read, "Starting our forever. Life is too short not to choose happiness." I stared at that photograph for a long time, at Marcus's triumphant smile and Veronica's possessive grip on his arm, and felt something complex move through me. Humiliation, certainly. Fresh pain at the public nature of his relationship with the woman he had been cheating with throughout our marriage. But underneath those immediate reactions was something else. A cold, crystallizing understanding that Marcus's need to flaunt his new relationship, to publicly humiliate me, revealed a profound insecurity and vindictiveness that would ultimately be his weakness. Rachel was less concerned with the emotional impact than with the strategic implications. "This is actually helpful," she said when I forwarded her the screenshots. "It establishes a clear timeline of his relationship with her, which supports our argument that this affair predated your separation and influenced his financial behavior. And the expensive ring, the Hamptons vacation. All of this suggests he has access to significantly more assets than he's disclosed in discovery. We can use this. The divorce proceedings ground forward through the summer, each side filing motions and counter-motions, engaging in the expensive theater of high-stakes litigation. Marcus's attorneys continued to claim that his business was worth far less than my team believed, that most of the valuable assets were actually owned by holding companies that predated our marriage, that I was entitled to minimal support, given my own substantial income. My forensic accountants told a different story, identifying patterns of income and asset transfers that suggested Marcus had been systematically hiding wealth in preparation for divorce. But proving what we suspected and getting a court to agree were two different challenges, and as summer turned to fall, I was beginning to feel the strain of sustained combat. Then, in mid-August, everything changed. Marcus's mother, Sophia Castellano, died suddenly of a massive stroke. She was 73 years old, had been in apparently good health, and her death shocked everyone who knew her. Despite the bitter divorce proceedings, I felt genuine grief. Sophia had been kind to me throughout my marriage to Marcus, one of the few members of his wealthy, status-conscious family who had treated me as an equal rather than as someone who had married above her station. Marcus was devastated by his mother's death in a way that seemed genuine despite everything I had learned about his capacity for performance. He requested a temporary pause in divorce proceedings for the funeral and estate settlement, and Rachel advised me to agree, saying it would look better to a judge than appearing heartless during his bereavement. I attended Sophia's funeral, sitting in the back of the church, watching Marcus play the grieving son surrounded by Veronica and various family members. I paid my respects to a woman who had shown me kindness, and then I returned to my own life, assuming that Sophia's death, while tragic, would have no direct impact on my situation. I could not have been more wrong. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a phone call from an attorney I did not know, a man named Harold Breskin who identified himself as the executor of Sophia Castellano's estate. He asked if I would be available to come to his office in Midtown Manhattan the following day for a meeting regarding the will. His tone was formal but held an undertone of something that sounded almost like satisfaction. I agreed to the meeting, confused about why I would be included in discussions about Sophia's estate given that Marcus and I were divorcing. Rachel advised me to attend but to be extremely careful about what I said, as anything discussed could potentially affect our divorce proceedings. The next afternoon, I arrived at Harold Breskin's office, a suite in a prestigious Midtown building that suggested expensive legal expertise. The reception area was decorated with understated elegance, and I was shown into a conference room where several people were already seated. Marcus was there, looking haggard in a way that surprised me. Veronica sat beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. Several other Castellano family members occupied other seats around the large table. Harold Breskin entered a moment after I was seated, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of professional neutrality that did not quite hide what looked like suppressed amusement. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with white hair and the kind of lined face that suggested decades of dealing with wealthy families and their complicated dynamics. "Thank you all for coming," he began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "We're here today for the reading of Sophia Marie Castellano's last will and testament, executed and notarized 8 months ago. Mrs. Castellano was very specific about her wishes, and about who should be present for this reading." He opened the portfolio and extracted a thick document. "I'll spare you the extensive legal preliminaries and cut to the substantive provisions. Mrs. Castellano's estate is valued at approximately $38 million, including real estate, investments, and various other assets. She was very deliberate in how she chose to distribute this wealth." Marcus shifted in his seat, clearly expecting to hear that he had inherited the bulk of his mother's considerable estate. As Sophia's only child, it would be the natural assumption. I wondered again why I had been asked to attend, unless Sophia had left me some small personal item as a gesture of affection despite the divorce. Harold continued reading, his voice steady and professional. "To my son Marcus Vincent Castellano, I leave my personal jewelry, my art collection and my property in Palm Beach, Florida, along with $50,000 to cover any immediate expenses related to settling my affairs." The silence in the room was absolute. $50,000 from a $38 million estate. Marcus had gone very pale, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "The remainder of my estate," Harold continued, and I saw his lips twitch slightly, "I leave in its entirety to my daughter-in-law, Diana Marie Castellano, with the following provisions and explanation." Every eye in the room turned to me. I felt as though all the air had been sucked from the space, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear Harold's next words. "I do this for several reasons which I want clearly stated. First, Diana has been nothing but respectful, kind, and gracious to me throughout her marriage to my son, treating me with genuine affection rather than the obligation I sense from Marcus. Second, I am aware of my son's infidelity and his plans to divorce Diana, while minimizing her financial settlement. I find his behavior unconscionable and will not reward it with wealth." Harold paused, letting those words sink in before continuing. "Third, and most importantly, the bulk of the wealth Marcus believes to be his own creation was actually built on initial capital I provided through loans and investments that were documented as gifts for tax purposes, but which I always intended to reclaim through my estate. Marcus has spent his adult life believing he was a self-made success, but in reality, his business was built on my money, my connections, and my willingness to bail him out of his poor decisions repeatedly." Marcus made a strangled sound, but Harold held up a hand for silence and kept reading. "I leave this wealth to Diana because she has demonstrated the character, grace, and integrity that my son apparently failed to develop despite every advantage I provided him. Diana, I trust you will use these resources wisely, and will not allow Marcus to manipulate you into sharing what is rightfully yours according to my wishes and legal right to distribute my property as I see fit." The document continued with technical legal language about trusts, asset transfers, and various provisions, but I barely heard it. I sat frozen, trying to process what I had just learned. Sophia had left me $38 million. She had essentially disinherited her own son in favor of his soon-to-be ex-wife. She had done this deliberately, with full knowledge of our divorce proceedings, as a final statement about his character and hers. When Harold finished reading and looked up, the room erupted. Marcus was on his feet, shouting that the will had to be invalid, that his mother had clearly not been in her right mind, that I had obviously manipulated her somehow. Veronica's face had gone from triumphant to calculating, clearly doing math about what this meant for her future with Marcus. Various other family members began talking over each other, expressing shock and outrage. Harold Breskin allowed the chaos to continue for perhaps 30 seconds before he spoke with sharp authority. "The will is entirely valid and was executed when Mrs. Castellano was demonstrably of sound mind. She anticipated potential contests and took extensive precautions, including having her mental competency evaluated by 3 separate physicians within weeks of signing. Any attempt to contest will be expensive and futile, and will only delay the inevitable distribution of assets." He turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Castellano, I'll need you to stay after this meeting concludes, so we can discuss the estate in more detail and begin the transfer process. I have additional documents from Mrs. Castellano addressed personally to you." I managed to nod, still too stunned to fully process what was happening. Marcus was still shouting, his face red with rage, while Veronica whispered urgently in his ear. The other family members had divided into factions, some clearly sympathetic to Marcus, others looking at him with what might have been satisfaction that his arrogance had finally caught up with him. As the various family members filed out, still arguing and speculating, Marcus approached me with Veronica at his side. His expression was ugly with rage barely held in check. "You did this," he said, his voice low and shaking. "You manipulated my mother somehow, turned her against me. This will isn't going to stand, Diana. I'll fight it with everything I have." I found my voice finally, surprised by how calm it emerged. "I didn't even know your mother was revising her will, Marcus. Unlike you, I wasn't planning financial strategies behind people's backs. Sophia made her own choices based on her own assessment of your character. Perhaps you should consider what that assessment says about the person you've become." Veronica interjected, her voice sharp. "You can't seriously think you're entitled to money that should go to her own son. It's obscene. Any decent person would refuse the inheritance." I looked at her directly for the first time since entering the room. Any decent person wouldn't sleep with her married boss and help him hide assets from his wife. I think I'll save my concern about decency for people whose opinions actually matter to me. Marcus grabbed Veronica's arm and pulled her toward the door, but he turned back once more. That beach photo showing everyone how happy we are. How does it feel knowing that while you were inheriting my mother's money, I was public about choosing Veronica over you? I moved on, Diana. I won. The words were meant to wound, to assert his victory even in the face of this shocking reversal. But looking at him in that moment, at his desperate need to claim victory even as everything fell apart, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a kind of sad clarity. You're right, Marcus, I said quietly. You did move on. You moved on to a relationship built on betrayal and hidden in hotel rooms for years. You moved on to flaunting that relationship in public specifically to hurt me. You moved on to a future that you planned meticulously while lying to everyone in your life. And now you're discovering what your mother thought of the man you became in pursuit of what you wanted. So yes, you won. Congratulations. After they left, I remained in the conference room with Harold Breskin, my hands shaking as the reality of the situation fully penetrated my shock. $38 million. Sophia had left me $38 million and had done so specifically to punish her son for his treatment of me. Harold handed me a sealed envelope. Sophia wanted you to have this privately. She recorded several video messages as well, which are stored digitally and can be accessed through the estate portal I'll set up for you. But she wanted you to read this letter first, before you make any decisions about the inheritance. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and extracted several pages of Sophia's elegant handwriting. The letter began simply. My dear Diana, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you now know what I have chosen to do with my estate. I imagine you are shocked and confused, so let me explain. What followed was both the most affirming and the most painful letter I have ever received. Sophia detailed her growing awareness of Marcus's affair, her disappointment in the son she had raised, and her admiration for the grace and strength I had shown even when I had not known I was being betrayed. She acknowledged that leaving me her estate was unusual, perhaps even vindictive, but she was beyond caring about conventional propriety when she saw injustice being committed. The letter explained that most of Marcus's business success was indeed built on her money and connections, something she had deliberately concealed from him to allow him to believe he was self-made. She had done this thinking it would build character and work ethic, but she had come to realize it had only built arrogance and entitlement. Her final paragraphs addressed me directly. Diana, you owe Marcus nothing. Not explanation, not compromise, not a single dollar of what I am leaving you. This money represents my acknowledgement of what you endured, my statement about the values that matter to me, and my hope that you will use these resources to build a life of meaning and purpose. Do not let my son or anyone else make you feel guilty for accepting what I freely chose to give you. Be fierce in protecting yourself and what you deserve. I sat in that conference room, reading and rereading Sophia's letter, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. For months, I had been fighting Marcus's attempts to minimize my contributions and maximize his share of our marital assets. I had been defending my worth, justifying my claims, battling against his narrative that I deserved minimal consideration. Now, in a twist I could never have anticipated, the battle had shifted entirely. Marcus's mother had given me resources that dwarfed anything I could have won in the divorce. She had made a public statement about his character that no court judgment could match, and she had entrusted me with wealth that came with responsibility, but also with absolute freedom to determine my own path forward. The divorce proceedings changed dramatically after the will reading. Marcus's attorneys immediately filed motions arguing that Sophia's bequest should be considered in calculating what I was entitled to from the marital estate, claiming I was now far wealthier than Marcus and should receive nothing from our division of assets. Rachel countered that the inheritance was entirely separate from marital property and irrelevant to our proceedings, and that Marcus's attempts to use it to avoid his obligations only further demonstrated his character. The public nature of Sophia's decision also meant that Marcus's business reputation began to suffer. Word spread through his professional circles about his mother's devastating final judgment of his character. Some business contacts distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone his own mother had essentially disowned. Others began scrutinizing his business practices more carefully, wondering what else he might have misrepresented if even his origin story of self-made success was false. Marcus's engagement to Veronica lasted another 2 months before dissolving acrimoniously. Without the financial stability he had promised her, without the successful trajectory she had signed up for when she decided to become involved with her married boss, Veronica apparently decided that love was less compelling than she had claimed. She left him for one of his former business associates, adding insult to the injury of his unraveling life. The Hamptons beach photos, which had been designed to humiliate me and showcase Marcus's triumphant new life, took on a different meaning in light of subsequent events. They became evidence of his arrogance and bad judgment, of his cruel need to flaunt a relationship that had already cost him his marriage and would eventually cost him far more. Those images of him smiling triumphantly, showing off his new fiancée and their expensive beach vacation, were now artifacts of a hubris that had preceded his catastrophic fall. As I sat alone in my apartment that evening after the will reading, still processing everything that had happened, I realized that I was standing at a threshold. The person I had been, the woman who had defined herself through her marriage and her partnership with Marcus, no longer existed. The life I had been fighting to preserve some piece of was gone, revealed as an illusion built on lies. What remained was the opportunity to decide who I would become with the freedom and resources Sophia had gifted me. This inheritance was not just money. It was permission to stop defending my worth and start demonstrating it. It was validation from a woman whose judgment I respected, that I was not the problem in my failed marriage, that my contributions had value, that I deserved better than what I had accepted. The motivational core of my story was not yet complete. I had received an unexpected windfall, yes, but receiving resources is not the same as transforming them into meaningful purpose. That work still lay ahead, and I knew it would require me to become someone stronger, clearer, and more purposeful than the woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal in his office months ago. But for the first time since that terrible October evening, I felt something beyond rage or determination to survive. I felt the possibility of actually thriving, of building something meaningful from the ashes of everything I had lost. Marcus had tried to take my dignity, my financial security, and my sense of self-worth. His mother's will had not only prevented that theft but had given me resources to ensure I would never be vulnerable to such manipulation again. The story that had begun with humiliation on a Hamptons beach was transforming into something far more complex and ultimately more powerful. This was no longer just about divorce or betrayal or even justice. This was about the opportunity to demonstrate what character, integrity, and purpose could build when given the resources to thrive. And I was determined not to waste that opportunity. The morning after the will reading, I woke at dawn after barely sleeping, my mind racing through the implications of what had happened. The early light filtering through my bedroom curtains felt different somehow, as though the world itself had shifted on its axis overnight. I lay there for several minutes, testing the reality of my situation against the possibility that I had imagined or misunderstood what Harold Breskin had told me. But no, it was real. Sophia Castellano had left me $38 million. She had essentially disinherited her own son in favor of his soon-to-be ex-wife. She had done so with full awareness of what this decision meant, and with deliberate intent to make a statement about character, justice, and the values that mattered to her in her final accounting of her life. I got out of bed and went through my morning routine mechanically, showering and dressing in professional clothes even though I had taken the day off work to process everything. The familiar rituals grounded me, provided structure against the overwhelming sense of unreality that threatened to consume rational thought. As I made coffee in the kitchen of my apartment, the same kitchen where I had discovered Marcus's betrayal less than a year ago, I tried to organize my thoughts into some coherent framework for understanding what came next. The first call came at 7:30 in the morning. Rachel Weinstein, who apparently also started her workdays before most people finished their first cup of coffee. Her voice was brisk and energized in a way that suggested she had been awake for hours already. "Diana, I assume you've had time to process yesterday's bombshell. We need to talk strategy immediately." Marcus's legal team filed emergency motions last night arguing that Sophia's bequest should be factored into the divorce settlement. They're claiming you're now the wealthier party and should receive nothing from marital assets. It's absurd legally, but we need to respond quickly and decisively. I sat down at my small kitchen table, cradling my coffee mug with both hands. "What are our options?" Rachel's response was immediate and certain. "We continue pressing our original claims. The inheritance is entirely separate from marital property and has no bearing on what you're entitled to from your marriage to Marcus. We also counterfile to accelerate the divorce proceedings now that we have even more evidence of his financial manipulation and character issues. Sophia's will is essentially a third-party testimony to his lack of integrity, and we can use that. She paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. But Diana, there's something else we need to discuss. With this inheritance, you no longer need to fight Marcus for every dollar just to ensure your financial security. You could walk away from the entire marital estate if you wanted to and still be extraordinarily wealthy. So the question becomes, what do you actually want from this divorce beyond the money? The question struck me with unexpected force. What did I want beyond financial security? For months, I had been focused purely on ensuring Marcus could not cheat me out of my fair share of what we had built together. The fight had been about justice, about refusing to let him rewrite history and minimize my contributions. But with Sophia's inheritance, the material stakes had changed entirely. I want acknowledgement, I said slowly, working through my thoughts as I spoke them. I want the legal record to reflect that I was a full partner in our marriage, that my contributions mattered, that his betrayal and financial manipulation were real and documented. I don't want him to be able to tell himself or anyone else that he gave me a generous settlement out of nobility. I want the truth in the record. Rachel made a satisfied sound. Good. That's what I was hoping you would say. Because we can absolutely achieve that. And with your changed financial situation, we can do it without you being vulnerable to his attempts to drag things out until you run out of money for legal fees. We can take this as far as it needs to go. After ending the call with Rachel, I sat for a long time looking out my kitchen window at the Brooklyn street below, watching early morning commuters heading toward the subway, joggers passing by with their dogs, delivery trucks making their rounds. Ordinary life continuing in its ordinary patterns, while my own life had become something I barely recognized. My phone rang again, this time showing my mother's number. Patricia Reeves, who had raised me as a single parent after my father died when I was 7, who had worked 2 jobs to ensure I could go to college, who had been quietly furious about Marcus's betrayal but had respected my need to handle the divorce in my own way. Diana, sweetheart, I just got your message from last night. Are you serious? His mother left you her entire estate? My mother's voice carried a mixture of shock and something that sounded almost like vindication. I had left her a brief voicemail the previous evening after returning home from Harold Breskin's office, knowing I could not possibly have the full conversation in my emotionally depleted state, but not wanting her to hear the news from some other source. It's true, Mom. $38 million. She left Marcus almost nothing, just some personal items and $50,000. She knew about his affair and his plans to cheat me in the divorce, and this was her response. My mother was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. That woman understood what it means to see injustice and actually do something about it. Diana, I know this must feel overwhelming, but I hope you recognize what this really is. It's not just money. It's someone with power and resources choosing to use them to correct an imbalance, to support someone who deserved support. It's validation that you are not crazy for feeling betrayed and wronged. Her words resonated deeply, articulating something I had been feeling but had not quite been able to name. For months, Marcus and his attorneys had been constructing a narrative in which I was the unreasonable party, demanding more than I deserved, refusing to accept the natural end of a marriage that had run its course. They had been systematically undermining my reality, suggesting that my perception of his betrayal was exaggerated, that my claims on our assets were inflated by bitterness rather than grounded in legitimate contribution. Sophia's will demolished that narrative. A woman with no obligation to take my side, who could have simply left her estate to her son as would be conventional and expected, had instead made a clear moral judgment about who deserved her support and resources. It was validation of the most powerful kind precisely because it came from someone with nothing to gain from supporting me. I think I'm still in shock, I admitted to my mother. I keep waiting to wake up and discover this was some kind of stress-induced dream. What am I supposed to do with $38 million, Mom? I don't even know how to begin thinking about that kind of wealth. My mother's response was characteristically practical. You start by taking care of the immediate necessities. You get good financial advisors, you protect the inheritance legally, you make sure Marcus can't touch it or use it against you somehow. And then, when you've had time to breathe and think clearly, you decide what kind of life you want to build and what kind of impact you want to have. This is an opportunity, Diana, not a burden. Don't let shock or overwhelm prevent you from recognizing that. After we ended the call, I began making a list, falling back on the organizational skills that had served me throughout my corporate career. Immediate needs. Meetings with Harold Breskin to formalize the estate transfer, consultations with financial advisors about managing significant wealth, conversations with Rachel about divorce strategy, given the changed circumstances. Medium-term considerations. Decisions about my career and whether I wanted to continue in corporate marketing or explore other paths now that financial necessity was no longer a constraint. Long-term questions. What kind of life did I actually want to build? And what did I want to be remembered for beyond being a woman who received an unexpected inheritance? The list helped center me, providing concrete action steps that made the overwhelming feel slightly more manageable. I was still working through these plans when my phone rang yet again, this time showing a number I did not recognize with a Manhattan area code. Miss Castellano, this is Jennifer Morrison from the New York Chronicle. I'm hoping to speak with you about Sophia Castellano's will and the unusual decision to leave her estate to you rather than her son. Would you be willing to comment for an article we're running? My stomach dropped. Of course the media would be interested in this story. Wealthy woman disinherits her son in favor of his soon-to-be ex-wife, publicly condemning his character in her will. It had all the elements of compelling drama, and given the Castellano family's prominence in New York real estate and social circles, it would be newsworthy regardless of my involvement. I have no comment, I said firmly. This is a private family matter, and I won't be discussing it publicly. Jennifer Morrison's voice took on a coaxing tone. I understand your reluctance, but the story is going to run with or without your input. Wouldn't you prefer to have your perspective included? We already have comments from several Castellano family members suggesting that you manipulated Sophia, or that the will should be contested. This is your opportunity to respond. The implication was clear. Speak now or let others control the narrative. It was a familiar tactic, one I recognized from my years in corporate communications where managing public perception was part of my professional skill set. But this was not a corporate crisis. This was my life, and I had no obligation to perform it for public consumption. My answer remains no comment. I won't be participating in turning a family tragedy into entertainment. If you have further questions, please direct them to my attorney. I provided Rachel's contact information and ended the call. Within hours, my phone was inundated with calls from various media outlets, all asking for interviews or comments. I turned off the ringer and let everything go to voicemail, feeling besieged in my own apartment. This was an aspect of sudden wealth I had not anticipated. The loss of privacy, the public interest in what should have been a private matter, the way strangers felt entitled to my story and my response. By mid-afternoon, the first articles began appearing online. The New York Chronicle ran with a headline that made me wince. Real estate heir disinherited. Mother leaves fortune to son's ex-wife in stunning rebuke. The article quoted several anonymous Castellano family members expressing shock and suggesting that I must have manipulated Sophia in her final months. It also included a quote from Marcus himself, released through his publicist, that was clearly designed to paint me as opportunistic and himself as the victim of a grave injustice. My mother was not in her right mind in her final year, Marcus was quoted as saying. She had become increasingly confused and susceptible to manipulation. I am devastated by her death, and by the discovery that someone I trusted took advantage of her vulnerability. We will be contesting the will and expect that a court will restore the estate to its rightful heir. The statement was masterful in its construction, implying mental incompetence without stating it directly, suggesting manipulation without making specific accusations that could be legally challenged, and positioning himself as the grieving son rather than the disinherited offspring whose mother had publicly condemned his character. I felt a surge of rage reading it, recognizing the same tactics he had used throughout our marriage. Careful manipulation of facts to construct whatever narrative served his purposes. Rachel called within minutes of the article posting. Ignore it. Do not respond, do not engage, do not let him bait you into a public fight. Harold Breskin is releasing a statement through the estate's legal team providing documentation of Sophia's mental competency, and making clear that any contest of the will is futile. We let the lawyers handle the public narrative while we focus on the actual legal proceedings. Her advice was sound, but following it required a level of restraint that did not come naturally to me. I wanted to defend myself, to correct the false implications, to ensure that everyone knew Marcus was lying about his mother's mental state and my supposed manipulation. But I also understood that engaging would only feed the story, would make me a more interesting target for media attention, and would accomplish nothing productive. Instead, I focused on the practical tasks that would move my situation forward. I met with Harold Breskin for several hours at his office, signing documents to formalize the estate transfer, and learning about the complex structure of Sophia's investments, properties, and various assets. The portfolio was sophisticated, reflecting decades of careful wealth management and strategic investments. Harold had assembled a team of financial advisors who specialized in working with high-net-worth individuals, and they began the process of educating me about options for managing and growing the inheritance. The education was overwhelming. I learned about trust structures and tax strategies, about diversification principles and risk management, about philanthropic vehicles and estate planning for my own eventual legacy. The advisors spoke in jargon that I gradually learned to decode, explaining concepts like qualified dividends and capital gains treatment, discussing asset allocation models and rebalancing strategies. My head spun with information, but I forced myself to pay attention and ask questions, refusing to simply delegate everything to professionals without understanding the fundamental principles of what they were recommending. One of the advisors, a woman named Catherine Wu who specialized in working with women who had suddenly come into significant wealth through divorce or inheritance, was particularly helpful. She understood that I was not just learning to manage money but was processing grief, anger, and a fundamental disruption to my sense of identity and purpose. Sudden wealth, even when it seems like an entirely positive development, is actually quite destabilizing, Catherine explained during one of our sessions. Your entire relationship to work, to financial security, to planning for the future, has been fundamentally altered. You're no longer working primarily for income or building savings for retirement. Those basic motivations that structure most people's lives no longer apply to you. That can create a kind of existential confusion that people don't often talk about. Her observation was accurate. I had spent my entire adult life working toward financial security, building a career that would provide stability and opportunity, planning carefully for a future that required saving and investing, and making responsible choices. Now, almost overnight, all of those considerations had become irrelevant. I could quit my job tomorrow and never work again if I chose. I could travel anywhere, buy anything, pursue any interest without regard to cost. The constraints that had structured my decision-making for 4 decades had simply evaporated. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Without the framework of financial necessity, how did I decide what to do with my time and energy? What was work for if not income? What was the point of professional achievement if I no longer needed career advancement to ensure my security? These were questions I had never imagined having to confront, questions that felt simultaneously like extraordinary privilege and genuine crisis. As September turned to October, I began to establish new routines that helped ground me in my transformed circumstances. I continued working at my corporate job, not because I needed the income but because the structure and sense of purpose it provided felt necessary while I figured out what came next. My colleagues knew something significant had happened based on media coverage of Sophia's will, but I offered minimal details and most people respected my privacy. The divorce proceedings continued, with Marcus's attorneys becoming increasingly aggressive, as they realized that their strategy of exhausting me financially would not work. Rachel had been right that my changed financial situation gave me the freedom to pursue justice without compromise. We pushed back on every attempt to minimize my share of marital assets. We demanded full disclosure of Marcus's hidden accounts and income streams, and we prepared for trial if necessary rather than accepting any settlement that did not fully acknowledge my contributions and his deceptions. Marcus himself became increasingly volatile as his situation deteriorated. The engagement to Veronica had ended badly, with her publicist releasing a statement suggesting she had been deceived about Marcus's true financial situation and character. Several of his business partners had begun distancing themselves, concerned about being associated with someone whose own mother had so publicly condemned His attempts to contest Sophia's will were going nowhere, with Harold Breskin providing overwhelming documentation of her mental competency and clear intent. In early November, nearly 3 months after the will reading, Marcus made an unexpected move. He contacted me directly, bypassing our attorneys, and asked to meet privately to discuss resolving everything amicably. Rachel strongly advised against such a meeting, arguing that anything he wanted to discuss could be communicated through legal channels, and that meeting alone created risk of manipulation or of saying something that could be used against me later. But I was curious about what Marcus thought he could accomplish with a direct appeal, and some part of me wanted the opportunity to speak with him without attorneys present, to say things that had been filtered through legal caution for months. Against Rachel's advice, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Manhattan that was public enough to ensure nothing inappropriate could occur but quiet enough for private conversation. Marcus arrived precisely on time, looking worse than I had seen him even at his mother's funeral. He had lost weight, and his expensive suit hung slightly loose on his frame. The confident arrogance that had characterized his demeanor throughout our marriage and the early months of our divorce had been replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. We ordered coffee and sat at a corner table, an awkward silence stretching between us as we both seemed to search for how to begin a conversation that had no template or precedent in our history. "Thank you for meeting with me," Marcus finally said, his voice lacking its usual assertive tone. "I know you have no reason to do me any favors, but I'm asking you to hear me out." I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I had learned through the months of divorce proceedings that silence was often more powerful than filling space with words. Marcus wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, staring into it rather than meeting my eyes. "My mother's will has destroyed everything I built. My business partners don't trust me. Clients are pulling contracts. My reputation in the industry is ruined. The woman I thought I would marry left me as soon as the money situation changed. I'm facing the possibility of losing my company entirely, of having to sell everything just to maintain basic solvency." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his expression that might have been genuine vulnerability, or might have been a performance designed to manipulate sympathy. With Marcus, it was often impossible to distinguish between the two. "I know I treated you terribly," he continued. "I know I lied and cheated and planned to leave you with as little as possible. I have no excuse for that except that I convinced myself I deserved everything I had built, that your contributions were minimal, that you would be fine on your own. I was wrong about all of that and I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between us. I studied his face, trying to determine whether this represented genuine remorse or simply another strategy, now that all his other approaches had failed. Perhaps the truth was more complicated than either pure manipulation or pure sincerity, some mixture of self-interested calculation and actual recognition of harm caused. "What do you want, Marcus?" I asked directly. "You didn't ask for this meeting just to apologize. What is it you're hoping to accomplish?" He took a deep breath before answering. "I'm asking you to give me my mother's inheritance, or even just part of it. Enough to stabilize my business and rebuild what I've lost. You don't need it, Diana. You already have more money than you could spend in several lifetimes. But that inheritance could save me from complete ruin." There it was, the actual purpose of this meeting, stripped of all preliminary softening. Marcus wanted me to give him the money his mother had deliberately chosen not to leave him, to undo her final moral judgment and restore him to the position he felt entitled to occupy. I felt a complex mixture of emotions surge through me. Part of me recognized his desperation and felt a residual impulse toward compassion, an echo of the years when I had loved him and wanted his success. But a larger part felt something much colder and clearer. Recognition that even now, even in his apparent humility and vulnerability, Marcus fundamentally believed he deserved what he wanted regardless of what anyone else's needs or rights or judgments might be. "Your mother left you her estate with full knowledge of our situation and deliberate intent about what that decision meant," I said carefully. "She documented her reasoning extensively. She wanted me to have those resources, and she wanted you to understand that your behavior and character had consequences. Why would I dishonor her wishes and her judgment just because you're unhappy with the results of your own choices?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgent edge. "Because holding on to that money just to spite me doesn't actually benefit you in any way. You gain nothing from my destruction. If anything, being known as the woman who accepted millions from her ex-husband's mother, and then refused to help him when he was desperate makes you look vindictive and cruel. But if you help me now, you demonstrate real character, real magnanimity. You show that you're better than the situation, bigger than the hurt. The argument was sophisticated, appealing to my desire to see myself as a person of character while framing any refusal to give him what he wanted as evidence of smallness and spite. I recognized the manipulation even as I acknowledged that part of what he said had emotional resonance. Did holding firmly to Sophia's wishes make me vindictive? Was there value and mercy even toward someone who had shown me none? I appreciate you sharing your perspective, I said slowly, giving myself time to think through my response. But I think you're fundamentally misunderstanding the situation. Your mother's inheritance isn't something I'm keeping from you out of spite. It's something she chose to give to me because she valued what I represented and disapproved of what you had become. Giving you that money wouldn't demonstrate magnanimity. It would demonstrate disrespect for her judgment and her right to dispose of her property according to her own values. Marcus's expression hardened, the vulnerability shifting back towards something more familiar. Anger at not getting what he wanted. So that's your answer? You're going to hide behind my dead mother's wishes while you watch me lose everything? I'm not hiding behind anything, I responded, keeping my voice level despite the anger rising in response to his accusation. I'm honoring the wishes of a woman who gave me an extraordinary gift for reasons she articulated clearly. You're the one trying to manipulate the situation, first by attempting to control the narrative through media statements about manipulation and mental incompetence, and now by trying to emotionally manipulate me directly into overriding what your mother explicitly wanted. I stood up, gathering my coat and bag. I genuinely hope you're able to rebuild your business and your life, Marcus. Not because I have any obligation to you, but because I don't actually want to see anyone destroyed. But I'm not going to give you Sophia's inheritance, and I'm not going to feel guilty about that decision. She made her choice for her own reasons, and I'm respecting it. I suggest you come to terms with that reality and figure out how to move forward from where you actually are rather than where you think you deserve to be. As I walked away from that coffee shop, leaving Marcus sitting alone at the table, I felt something click into place inside me. For months, I had been reactive, responding to his betrayals and his strategies and his attempts to control outcomes. But in that moment, I had claimed agency and clarity about what I owed and did not owe, what was mine to give and what was not mine to dispose of according to others' desires. The meeting had been a test of sorts, an opportunity to demonstrate whether wealth would make me a different person, or would instead amplify and clarify who I had always been underneath the compromises and accommodations of marriage to Marcus. I had chosen to remain true to Sophia's trust in me, to honor her judgment rather than allowing Marcus to manipulate me into undermining it. That choice felt like the beginning of truly inhabiting my new reality, rather than simply being buffeted by its implications. Over the following weeks, I began to shift from defensive posture to active planning. I met with Catherine Wu and her team to discuss philanthropic strategies, exploring ways to use Sophia's inheritance to address issues I cared deeply about. I had always been passionate about educational access for first-generation college students, having been one myself, and I began developing plans for a scholarship foundation that would provide not just tuition assistance, but comprehensive support for students navigating higher education without family knowledge or resources to draw on. The work of designing this foundation gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing, since my life had been upended. I was no longer just managing the fallout from Marcus's betrayal or processing shock about Sophia's inheritance. I was actively building something meaningful, using resources to create opportunities for others, beginning to answer the fundamental question of what I wanted my life to be about beyond mere survival and success. The divorce was finally resolved in mid-December through a settlement that gave me more than Marcus had wanted to concede but less than the maximum we might have won at trial. Rachel had negotiated aggressively, and the final agreement included clear acknowledgement of my contributions to the marriage and Marcus's financial deceptions. More importantly to me than the specific dollar amounts, the settlement included language that validated my version of events and created a legal record that contradicted Marcus's attempts to rewrite our history. On a cold December afternoon, I signed the final papers in Rachel's office, officially ending my marriage to Marcus Castellano. The moment felt simultaneously monumental and oddly anticlimactic. After a year of legal combat, of revelations and reversals and emotional upheaval, the actual ending came down to signatures on documents and a judge's stamp of approval. "How do you feel?" Rachel asked after the papers were signed and notarized. I considered the question seriously. How did I feel? Not triumphant exactly, though there was satisfaction in having fought for, and won acknowledgement of the truth. Not devastated, though there was real grief for the loss of what I had believed my marriage was. Mostly, I felt something that resembled cautious hope mixed with hard-won wisdom. "I feel like I survived something that was meant to destroy me," I said slowly, "and I feel like I have an opportunity now to build something that actually reflects who I am rather than who I thought I needed to be to maintain a marriage that was never what I believed it was." Rachel nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right perspective. You're not defined by what Marcus did to you or even by what Sophia gave you. You're defined by what you choose to do with your freedom and your resources and your hard-earned understanding of your own strength." As I left Rachel's office and walked out into the December cold, I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, discovering her husband's betrayal and feeling like her entire world had collapsed. That woman had believed her worth was tied to her marriage, her identity inseparable from being Marcus's wife, her future dependent on preserving some version of the life she had thought she was living. The woman I was now understood that identity built on illusion was no identity at all, that worth derived from external validation was inherently unstable, and that real strength came not from avoiding devastation but from surviving it and choosing to build something meaningful from what remained. The Hamptons beach photos, which had once felt like the ultimate humiliation, now seemed like artifacts from someone else's story. Marcus's attempt to flaunt his new relationship and publicly demonstrate his triumph had preceded a fall so complete that those images now served primarily as evidence of hubris and poor judgment. His mother's will had indeed ruined him, not through any action of mine but through his own behavior finally meeting consequences he had assumed his privilege would protect him from. But more importantly than Marcus's ruin was my own reconstruction. Sophia's inheritance had given me resources, yes, but the real gift had been permission to stop defending and start building. To stop proving my worth and start demonstrating it through action. To stop being defined by relationships and betrayals and instead define myself through purpose and contribution. As I headed home through the Brooklyn streets, Christmas lights beginning to appear in windows and on doorways, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Genuine excitement about the future. Not because I knew exactly what that future would hold, but because I finally understood that I had the freedom, resources, and hard-won wisdom to make it whatever I chose to create. The story that had begun with betrayal and humiliation was transforming into something else entirely. Something about resilience and purpose, and the unexpected ways that justice sometimes arrives. I was no longer Marcus's victim, or even Sophia's beneficiary. I was simply Diana, a woman who had survived devastation, and was determined to build something meaningful from the opportunity that survival had created. And that felt like the beginning of a story worth living. The winter following my divorce settlement was a season of quiet transformation. I had taken an extended leave from my corporate position, not because I needed to recover from the emotional toll of the past year, though that would have been justification enough, but because I had finally acknowledged that returning to my old life in any meaningful way was neither possible nor desirable. The person who had built a career in pharmaceutical marketing, who had measured success by promotions and performance reviews, no longer existed. In her place was someone fundamentally changed by betrayal, inheritance, and the hard work of rebuilding identity from its foundations. I spent the early weeks of January in my Brooklyn apartment, deliberately creating space for reflection, rather than rushing into action. Catherine Wu had advised me that many people who suddenly acquired significant wealth made poor decisions in the immediate aftermath, driven by a desire to prove something, or to fill the void left by whatever had precipitated their changed circumstances. Better, she suggested, to take time to genuinely consider what I valued and wanted before committing to any particular path forward. The advice was sound, but following it required a tolerance for uncertainty that did not come naturally to me. I had spent my entire adult life as a person who made plans, who set goals and worked systematically toward them, who measured progress through tangible achievements. Sitting with open questions about purpose and direction felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible, as though I were wasting the opportunity Sophia had given me by not immediately deploying it toward some clear objective. But gradually, In the quiet of those January days, I began to understand that the discomfort itself was valuable. I had never before had the luxury of asking fundamental questions about what I actually wanted, rather than what circumstances demanded, or what seemed like the responsible choice. Every major decision of my adult life had been constrained by financial necessity, by career trajectory considerations, by the requirements of marriage and partnership with Marcus. Now, for the first time, I could ask myself what mattered to me independent of all those external frameworks. The question proved more difficult to answer than I had anticipated. When I stripped away the goals that had been imposed by circumstance or adopted, because they seemed like what successful people pursued, what remained? What did Diana Castellano actually care about deeply enough to organize her life around? I began keeping a journal, something I had not done since college, using it to explore these questions without the pressure of arriving at immediate answers. I wrote about my childhood as the daughter of a single mother who had worked constantly to provide stability and opportunity, about the professors who had encouraged my academic abilities when I had been uncertain about belonging in higher education, about the early years with Marcus when I had genuinely believed we were building something meaningful together. I wrote about the moment I had discovered his betrayal, and the year of legal combat that had followed. I wrote about Sophia's unexpected gift, and what it meant to be trusted with resources I had never sought. Patterns began to emerge from this writing, themes that appeared repeatedly across different memories and experiences. Education as a transformative force, the difference that mentorship and support made for people navigating unfamiliar territory, the importance of financial literacy and independence, the ways that systemic inequities created barriers that individual talent and effort alone could not overcome. These were not new interests exactly, but bringing them into conscious focus allowed me to recognize them as potential organizing principles for the next phase of my life. By late January, I had developed the outline of a plan that felt both ambitious and deeply aligned with what I had discovered mattered most to me. I would establish a comprehensive foundation focused on supporting first-generation college students, providing not just financial assistance, but the full range of support services that made the difference between accessing higher education and actually succeeding in it. The foundation would offer mentorship programs, financial literacy education, career development resources, and emergency funding for the unexpected expenses that often derailed students without family safety nets to rely on. The plan was expansive in scope and would require significant capital, but I had significant capital to deploy. More importantly, I had personal experience with being the first person in my family to navigate higher education, with the particular challenges that came from lacking the cultural knowledge and social networks that students from more privileged backgrounds took for granted. I understood viscerally why talented, hardworking students sometimes failed to complete degrees not because of academic inability, but because of 1,000 small barriers that more advantaged students never even noticed. I presented the concept to Catherine Wu and her team in early February, nervous about whether the plan was too ambitious or whether I was qualified to undertake something of this scale. Catherine listened carefully to my presentation, asked incisive questions about implementation details and long-term sustainability, and then smiled with what looked like genuine approval. "This is exactly the kind of philanthropic initiative that has lasting impact," she said. "It is specific enough to have focus and measurable outcomes, but comprehensive enough to address root causes rather than just symptoms. And it clearly comes from personal understanding, rather than abstract good intentions. You are going to need to build an excellent team and develop sophisticated operational systems, but this is absolutely viable." Her endorsement gave me confidence to move forward with actual implementation. I began the process of formally establishing the foundation as a legal entity, working with attorneys who specialized in nonprofit structure and compliance. I hired an executive director with extensive experience in educational philanthropy, a woman named Dr. Lauren Mitchell who had spent 20 years working with college access programs and brought both practical expertise and genuine passion for the mission. Together, Lauren and I began building the infrastructure that would allow the foundation to operate effectively at scale. We developed criteria for selecting students to support, created systems for delivering mentorship and services, established partnerships with colleges and universities willing to collaborate on integrated support programming. The work was consuming and complex, requiring me to learn rapidly about nonprofit management, educational systems, and the specific challenges facing the population we aim to serve. For the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, I felt genuinely engaged with something beyond my own survival and recovery. The foundation work gave me purpose that was not reactive, goals that were not about defending myself or proving my worth, and a sense of contributing to something larger than my own circumstances. I was using the resources Sophia had entrusted to me in ways that honored her stated values, and that reflected my own deepest commitments. As winter turned to spring, the foundation began to take tangible shape. We announced our first cohort of scholarship recipients in April, 20 students from across the country who would receive comprehensive support through their undergraduate years. I attended the award ceremony at our newly established headquarters in Manhattan, a renovated brownstone that served as both operational center and gathering space for students and mentors. Meeting those first scholarship recipients was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. They were young people with remarkable stories of resilience and determination, students who had overcome extraordinary obstacles to reach the threshold of higher education, and who now had the support they needed to actually succeed, rather than simply survive. I saw myself reflected in their combination of excitement and uncertainty, their determination mixed with realistic awareness of the challenges ahead. One student in particular made a lasting impression. Maria Santos was 19 years old, the daughter of immigrant parents who had sacrificed enormously to give their children opportunities they had never had. She had been accepted to an elite university but had been on the verge of declining admission because the financial aid package, while generous, still left gaps that her family could not possibly fill. Our foundation's support had made it possible for her to accept, and she spoke at the ceremony about what that meant with an eloquence that brought many in the audience to tears. "I used to think that working hard and getting good grades would be enough," Maria said, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "But I learned that there are so many costs beyond tuition. So many things you need to know that nobody tells you if you are the first in your family to go to college. This foundation is not just giving me money. It is giving me a community, people who understand what it is like to navigate a world where you do not know the rules everyone else seems to know automatically. It is giving me permission to belong in spaces that I was afraid I did not have the right to occupy." Her words articulated something profound about what we were trying to create. The foundation was not simply about removing financial barriers, though that was certainly important. It was about addressing the more subtle but equally powerful barriers of social capital, cultural knowledge, and the psychological burden of feeling like an imposter in spaces designed for people with very different backgrounds and resources. After the ceremony, I spoke privately with several of the scholarship recipients, learning about their specific circumstances and aspirations. Their diversity was striking, not just demographically but in terms of their academic interests, career goals, and the particular challenges they had overcome. Some came from rural communities where college attendance was rare. Others came from urban environments where survival often took precedence over education. Some had dealt with family instability, others with immigration status complications, others with health issues or learning disabilities that made conventional educational paths more difficult. What united them was determination, intellectual ability, and the understanding that education represented a pathway to different possibilities. They reminded me powerfully of why this work mattered, why using Sophia's inheritance to create opportunities for others was a more meaningful legacy than anything I could have built solely for my own benefit. As the foundation became operational and began serving its first cohort of students, I found myself thinking often about the trajectory of the past 18 months. I had begun that period as someone whose identity was deeply entangled with marriage to Marcus, whose sense of worth was validated through career achievement and the appearance of having built a successful life. The discovery of his betrayal had shattered that identity completely, forcing me to confront how much of what I had believed about myself and my life was actually illusion. The year that followed had been about survival initially, about protecting myself legally and financially from someone who had revealed himself to be far more ruthless than I had understood. But it had also been about something deeper and more important: the gradual construction of an identity based on my own values rather than on relationship status or external validation. The work of building the foundation represented the fullest expression yet of that reconstructed identity. I was no longer Diana Castellano who had to prove she deserved her share of marital assets, Or Diana Castellano, who had received an unexpected inheritance from her ex-mother-in-law. I was Diana Castellano, who had survived devastating betrayal and had chosen to use the resources and wisdom gained from that experience to create opportunities for others facing their own challenges. The shift was subtle but profound, a reframing that located meaning in contribution, rather than in what had been done to me or given to me. In May, I had an unexpected encounter that brought this evolution into sharp relief. I was having coffee with Lauren at a cafe near the Foundation offices, discussing plans for expanding our programming, when I noticed Marcus entering with a woman I did not recognize. He had not seen me, and my instinct was to leave immediately to avoid an awkward confrontation. But something made me stay, curiosity perhaps, or a desire to test whether seeing him still had the power to disturb my hard-won equilibrium. Marcus looked better than he had at our December meeting, though still diminished from the polished confidence he had projected throughout our marriage. His clothing was expensive but not quite as perfectly tailored, his demeanor alert but with an edge of wariness. The woman with him appeared to be a business colleague, rather than a romantic interest based on their interaction, and they settled at a table across the cafe with briefcases and laptops suggesting a working meeting. He noticed me perhaps 10 minutes into their meeting, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, discomfort, and something that might have been curiosity or resentment. I offered a brief nod of acknowledgement, neither warm nor hostile, simply recognition of shared presence in the same space. He hesitated, clearly debating whether to approach, and then excused himself from his companion and walked over to where Lauren and I were sitting. "Diana," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I did not expect to see you here. It is a public cafe, Marcus. Neither of us has exclusive claim to the neighborhood." My response was mild, genuinely unbothered by his presence in a way that would have been impossible even a few months earlier. He glanced at Lauren, clearly curious about who she was but too proud to ask directly. "I have been reading about your foundation. The announcement of the scholarship recipients was in several publications. It sounds like an impressive program." There was something in his tone that suggested he was struggling to decide whether to be sincere or cutting, whether to acknowledge my success or to find some way to diminish it. I recognized the pattern from our years together. The way he had often undermined my professional achievements while maintaining plausible deniability about his intent. "Thank you. It is work that feels meaningful to me, using resources to address inequities in educational access." I kept my response brief and factual, not inviting extended conversation but also not cutting him off rudely. Marcus shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, but also apparently needing to say something more. "I wanted you to know that I have stabilized my business situation. Not back to where I was, but sustainable. I am rebuilding, being more strategic about partnerships and overhead. I am going to be fine." The statement seemed to be seeking some kind of response from me, acknowledgement or approval or perhaps contradiction. I recognized it as characteristic of Marcus to frame even factual updates about his circumstances as requiring my reaction or validation. But I felt no need to provide what he was implicitly requesting. "I am glad you are finding your footing," I said simply. "I genuinely do not wish you ill, Marcus. I hope you are able to build something you are proud of going forward." He studied my face as though trying to determine whether I was being sincere or subtly mocking him. "You have changed," he said finally. "You seem different. More settled, I guess. Less angry." The observation was accurate, though his framing suggested he saw my lack of ongoing anger toward him as being about him, rather than about my own growth and shifting priorities. I did not bother to correct this misperception. What Marcus understood or failed to understand about my internal state was no longer relevant to my life in any meaningful way. "People change when their circumstances change," I offered. "I have had quite a bit of change to process over the past 18 months. Lauren had remained silent during this exchange, sipping her coffee and checking her phone with the practiced disengagement of someone giving two people privacy while still being present. But she glanced up now with an expression that suggested she was ready to extract me if needed. Marcus seemed to recognize that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Well, I should get back to my meeting. It was good to see you, Diana. I mean that." After he returned to his table, Lauren looked at me with raised eyebrows. "That was your ex-husband?" The one from the Hamptons beach incident? I nodded, watching Marcus settle back into conversation with his colleague. He looked smaller somehow than he had in my memory, less significant, as though the power he had wielded over my emotional state for so long had evaporated once I stopped granting him that power. "How do you feel?" Lauren asked. "Are you okay?" I considered the question seriously. How did I feel? Surprisingly unbothered was the honest answer. Seeing Marcus had not triggered the surge of anger or pain or vindication that I might have expected. He was simply a person I used to be married to. Someone who had treated me badly, and was now dealing with consequences of his own choices, but who no longer occupied any significant space in my emotional landscape. "I feel fine," I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. He is part of my past, and not even the most important part anymore. What matters now is what I am building, not what I survived. Lauren smiled. "That is exactly the right perspective. You have moved on in the truest sense, not by pretending the past did not happen, but by making it irrelevant to your present and future." We returned to our conversation about foundation programming, and within minutes I had forgotten entirely about Marcus's presence in the cafe. The encounter that might once have dominated my thoughts for days had become simply a minor interruption, notable only for demonstrating how completely my emotional investment in him and his opinion of me had dissolved. As spring progressed into summer, I made several significant decisions about my life beyond the foundation work. I sold the Brooklyn brownstone that Marcus and I had purchased together, a property that had been part of the divorce settlement, but that I had maintained partially out of inertia. The space held too many memories of a life that no longer existed, and I recognized that continuing to live there was preventing me from fully moving forward. I purchased a different property, a spacious loft apartment in Manhattan that had never been Marcus's space or our space, just mine. I decorated it according to my own taste without considering anyone else's preferences, filling it with art that I loved and furniture chosen for comfort and beauty rather than impressive appearance. The process of creating this new living space felt symbolic of the larger project of creating a new life, intentional and aligned with who I had become rather than who I had been expected to be. I also made peace with my decision to leave my corporate career permanently. For months I had maintained the fiction that I was simply on extended leave, that I might eventually return to pharmaceutical marketing when I was ready. But the truth was that I had no intention of returning, and maintaining the pretense was not fair to my employer or to myself. I resigned formally in June, with genuine gratitude for the years of professional development and the income that had sustained me, but with clarity that this chapter of my life was complete. The foundation work expanded steadily throughout the summer and fall. We increased our scholarship cohorts, developed new partnerships with universities, created mentorship networks that connected our students with professionals in their fields of interest. I traveled frequently to meet with students, to speak at events about educational equity, to learn from other organizations doing similar work. The travel was revelatory in ways I had not anticipated. I had spent most of my adult life in the New York metropolitan area, with occasional vacations but never extended time exploring other places and contexts. Now, with both the financial resources and the professional justification to travel extensively, I discovered a broader world that challenged and expanded my thinking about education, opportunity, and social mobility. I visited programs in rural Appalachia where educational access looked entirely different than in urban centers, where geographic isolation and limited local opportunities created specific barriers that required different solutions. I spent time in the Southwest learning about the particular challenges facing Native American students navigating higher education, while maintaining connection to tribal communities and cultural practices. I met with organizations serving undocumented students, formerly incarcerated individuals seeking education as a pathway to different possibilities, students aging out of foster care without family support systems. Each of these experiences deepened my understanding of the complex ecology of barriers that prevented talented people from accessing the education that could transform their circumstances. The Foundation's work, I realized, would need to continue evolving to address this complexity, to resist the temptation toward one-size-fits-all solutions that failed to account for dramatically different contexts and needs. By the time the first anniversary of Sophia's death approached in late August, I had traveled to 15 states, supported 60 students through our various programs, hired a team of 20 staff members at the Foundation, and begun planning for the next phase of expansion. The work was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, demanding but deeply satisfying in ways my corporate career had never been. I marked the anniversary of Sophia's death privately, visiting her gravesite in an exclusive cemetery in Westchester County. I brought white roses, her favorite flower according to Harold Breskin, and spent time sitting near her headstone thinking about the extraordinary gift she had given me and trying to honor it well. The gravestone was elegant and understated, listing her name, dates, and a simple inscription. She chose justice over convention. I thought about those words, about the choice Sophia had made to leave her estate to me rather than her son, about the moral clarity that had driven that decision even knowing it would be controversial and contested. I hope I am using your gift well, I said quietly, speaking to the stone as though Sophia could somehow hear me. I am trying to do work that matters, to use these resources to create opportunities and address inequities. I think you would approve, but I will never know for certain. All I can do is try to be worthy of the trust you placed in me. A light rain had begun to fall, appropriate weather for contemplation at a grave site. I sat for a while longer, thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought me to this moment. Marcus's betrayal had destroyed what I thought was my life, but it had also freed me from a fundamentally dishonest relationship that was limiting my growth and potential. Sophia's inheritance had provided resources I never sought, but it had also provided permission to reimagine what I wanted my life to be about. The past 18 months had been among the most difficult of my life, but they had also been transformative in ways I was only beginning to fully appreciate. I had discovered strengths I did not know I possessed, clarified values that had been obscured by the accommodations of marriage, and found purpose that was genuinely mine rather than adopted from external expectations. As I left the cemetery and drove back toward Manhattan, I thought about the Foundation's upcoming expansion, and the students whose lives would be changed by the opportunities we were creating. I thought about the work still ahead, the challenges that would inevitably arise, the ongoing learning that meaningful philanthropic work required. But mostly I thought about how different I felt from the woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal in his office a year and a half earlier. That woman had felt her life collapsing, had questioned her judgment and her worth, had been devastated by the gap between what she believed her marriage was and what it actually had been. The woman I was now understood that sometimes what feels like an ending is actually an essential clearing away of what was never substantial or true, creating space for something more authentic and meaningful to emerge. I had lost a marriage that was built on lies, but I had gained clarity, purpose, and the resources to make a genuine difference in areas I cared deeply about. Marcus's attempt to humiliate me with those Hamptons beach photos, to demonstrate his triumph and my defeat, had preceded a reversal so complete that the images now seemed almost poignant in their display of misplaced confidence. His mother's will had indeed ruined him in the specific ways he had most feared, stripping away his financial security and social standing, forcing him to rebuild from a much diminished position. But the more important story was not about Marcus's downfall but about my reconstruction. The resources Sophia had provided were significant, but they were ultimately just tools. What mattered was the use I made of them, the purposes I pursued, the person I chose to become in the freedom that wealth and independence provided. I had chosen to become someone who created opportunities for others, who used privilege and resources to address rather than perpetuate inequity, who measured success not by personal accumulation, but by contribution to something larger than herself. These choices felt aligned with the deepest truths I had discovered about what mattered to me, about what gave life meaning beyond mere survival or conventional achievement. As I merged onto the highway heading back to the city, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point, difficult as much of it had been. I was building a life that was authentically mine, using resources to create change that mattered, honoring the trust that Sophia had placed in me by trying to be worthy of it through action, rather than merely accepting it passively. The story that had begun with betrayal and humiliation had become something far richer and more meaningful than I could have imagined in those early days of discovery and devastation. It had become a story about resilience, purpose, and the unexpected ways that life can reshape itself when we have the courage to let go of what no longer serves us and build something new from honest foundation. And as I drove through the late summer afternoon, rain pattering against my windshield and the city skyline appearing in the distance, I felt ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead, confident in my capacity to navigate them and grateful for the hard-won wisdom that had prepared me for this next chapter. The fall following the first anniversary of Sophia's death brought unexpected complications that tested both the Foundation's operational capacity and my own leadership abilities in ways I had not anticipated. Success, I was learning, created its own particular set of challenges, and rapid growth required constant adaptation and problem-solving that went far beyond the initial vision I had developed in those quiet January days of planning. The Foundation had expanded more quickly than our initial projections suggested. What we had designed as a carefully phased rollout of programming, beginning with 20 students and gradually scaling up over 5 years, had accelerated dramatically due to overwhelming demand and the media attention that accompanied our launch. By September, we were supporting 140 students across 30 universities, had a waiting list of over 2,000 applicants for the following year, and were receiving partnership proposals from educational institutions and corporate sponsors faster than we could properly evaluate them. The growth was gratifying in many ways, demonstrating genuine need for what we offered and validation that our approach resonated with students, educators, and funders alike. But it also strained our systems and staffing in ways that created real operational challenges. Lauren and I found ourselves working 12 and 14-hour days trying to maintain program quality while managing expansion, hiring new staff members, developing more sophisticated operational infrastructure, and responding to the constant demands for my time as the Foundation's public face and primary spokesperson. In early October, I received a call from a journalist at a major national magazine requesting an interview for a feature article about the Foundation and about my personal story. The journalist, a woman named Allison Kepler, had already done extensive research and approached the interview request with a level of knowledge about my divorce, Sophia's will, and Marcus's current circumstances that immediately put me on guard. "I am interested in the Foundation's work," Allison explained when we spoke by phone to discuss the potential interview. "But I am also interested in the larger story of how you got here, the inheritance that made the Foundation possible, and what it means that you are using money your ex-husband believes should have been his to create opportunities for disadvantaged students. There is a compelling narrative about justice, redemption, and using privilege responsibly that I think would resonate with readers." Her framing was sophisticated, acknowledging the human interest elements that would draw readers while positioning the story as being fundamentally about the Foundation's mission, rather than merely personal drama. But I was wary of having my story told by someone else, of having the complex reality of the past 2 years reduced to easily digestible narrative beats that might or might not reflect the nuances I understood to be most important. "I appreciate your interest," I told Allison carefully, "but I need to think about whether this kind of profile serves the Foundation's interests or whether it risks making the story about me personally rather than about the students we serve and the systemic issues we are trying to address." Allison's response suggested she had anticipated this concern. "I understand that hesitation, and it is actually what makes me think you are the right kind of person to profile. Too many wealthy philanthropists want the attention and recognition, want their generosity celebrated without examination of where the wealth came from, or whether their approach actually addresses root causes. You seem genuinely more interested in the work than in personal credit, which is exactly why your story is worth telling." The argument had merit, and after consulting with Lauren and with Catherine Wu, I agreed to the interview with clear parameters about what topics I would and would not discuss in detail. I would talk about the Foundation's mission and programming, about my own educational background and what had shaped my understanding of barriers to educational access, and in general terms about how Sophia's inheritance had made the Foundation possible. I would not discuss the intimate details of my marriage to Marcus, would not comment on his current circumstances beyond acknowledging that we were divorced, and would not allow the article to become primarily about personal drama rather than substantive issues. The interview took place over several sessions in late October, with Allison visiting the Foundation offices, attending a mentorship event where I interacted with students, and spending extended time in conversation with me about my vision for the Foundation's future and my philosophy about effective philanthropy. She was a skilled interviewer, asking probing questions that pushed me to articulate ideas I had not fully formed, drawing out the connections between my personal experience and my professional focus in ways that felt genuine rather than exploitative. During one of our conversations, Allison asked a question that caught me off guard with its directness. "Do you ever feel guilty about the inheritance? Not because you did anything wrong to obtain it, but because you benefited enormously from someone else's family conflict? Because you ended up with resources that many people would argue should have gone to Sophia's biological son regardless of his behavior? I sat with the question for a long moment before responding, recognizing that it touched on something I had grappled with privately but had not articulated publicly. I think guilt is probably the wrong word, I said slowly. But I do feel tremendous responsibility. Sophia chose to give me these resources for specific reasons that she articulated clearly. She was making a moral judgment about character, and about how she wanted her wealth used after her death. I did not seek that inheritance or manipulate her into leaving it to me, but I did accept it, and with that acceptance came obligation to use it in ways that honor her intentions and that justify her trust in me. I paused, gathering my thoughts. As for whether the money should have gone to Marcus regardless of his behavior, I fundamentally disagree with that premise. The idea that biological children are automatically entitled to parental wealth regardless of their own character or choices is exactly the kind of thinking that perpetuates dynasties and allows harmful behavior to be rewarded simply because of family connection. Sophia had every right to make judgments about who would use her wealth responsibly and in alignment with her values. She exercised that right, and I am trying to prove that her judgment was sound. Allison nodded, making notes. And what about Marcus himself? Do you ever wonder how different things might be if Sophia had left him the inheritance, or if she had split it between you? Do you think about the impact that her decision had on his life and his business? The question probed at something complex and not entirely comfortable. The truth was that I did sometimes think about the alternate scenarios, about how Marcus's trajectory might have been different if his mother had not made such a dramatic statement about his character through her will. But I also recognize that engaging too deeply with those counterfactuals was ultimately unproductive. I think about it occasionally, I admitted, but I try not to dwell on alternative scenarios that did not happen. Sophia made the choice she made based on her own values and judgment. Marcus's current circumstances are the result of his own decisions over many years, decisions that his mother found objectionable enough to disinherit him. I am not responsible for his choices or for his mother's response to those choices. I am only responsible for what I do with the opportunity she gave me. The interview concluded with Allison spending time with several of our scholarship recipients, hearing directly from students about what the Foundation's support meant for their educational access and success. Their testimonies were powerful and moving, young people articulating with remarkable clarity how specific barriers had been removed, and how specific supports had made the difference between accessing higher education and actually thriving in it. Maria Santos, the student who had spoken so eloquently at our first award ceremony, told Allison about her experience navigating her first year at an elite university with the Foundation's support. Before the scholarship, I was constantly stressed about money, about whether I could afford books or whether I would have to skip meals to make my budget work. I could not fully focus on my classes because I was always doing mental calculations about finances. The Foundation support removed that constant anxiety, but it also gave me something even more important. It gave me mentors who understood what it was like to be the first in my family at college, who could answer questions I did not even know I should be asking. It made me feel like I belonged in that space, like I had a right to be there and to succeed. Her words captured something essential about what we were trying to create. Something that went beyond simple financial assistance to address the more subtle, but equally powerful barriers of confidence, cultural knowledge, and social capital. I hoped that Allison's article would communicate that depth and complexity, rather than reducing the Foundation's work to a simple narrative about a wealthy woman giving away money. While waiting for the article to be published, the Foundation faced a challenge that tested our operational systems and my own decision-making in significant ways. One of our scholarship recipients, a young man named David Chan, was struggling academically in his second semester at university and was in danger of losing his scholarship due to the grade point average requirements we had established as part of our program criteria. Lauren brought the situation to my attention during a weekly operations meeting in early November. David's advisor reached out to let us know he is failing 2 courses and barely passing 2 others. Our standard policy is that students must maintain a 3.0 grade point average to continue receiving support, with 1 semester of probation if they fall below that threshold. David is well below 3.0, and this is his first semester with us, so there is no prior performance to consider. She laid out David's file on the conference table, and I reviewed his application materials and initial performance reports. He had been an exceptional student in high school, graduating near the top of his class from a challenging public school in Los Angeles. His application essay had detailed his family's immigration from China when he was 12, his parents' sacrifice in leaving professional careers to work minimum wage jobs in the United States, and his determination to succeed academically as a way of honoring that sacrifice. What does his advisor say about what is happening? I asked. Is this a case of not being academically prepared? Or is something else going on? Lauren consulted her notes. The advisor mentioned that David seems overwhelmed and isolated. He is not utilizing campus support services, is not connecting with other students, and appears to be dealing with significant anxiety that is interfering with his ability to function academically. The advisor suspects mental health issues but says David has not been receptive to suggestions that he seek counseling. The situation presented a dilemma that went to the heart of what kind of organization we wanted to be. On one hand, we had established clear academic performance standards for good reasons. Scholarships were competitive and limited, and we needed to ensure we were supporting students who could successfully complete their degrees. Students who failed to meet basic performance standards were taking resources that could go to others who would use them more effectively. On the other hand, David's struggles appeared to be related to exactly the kinds of challenges we had designed the foundation to help students navigate. The transition to college for first-generation students was often complicated by factors beyond pure academic preparation. Mental health issues, family pressures, cultural adjustment, and lack of familiarity with how to access support systems all created barriers that had nothing to do with intellectual capability. If we simply enforced our grade point average requirement mechanically without considering context and without offering additional support, were we not perpetuating exactly the kind of rigid system that disadvantaged students who face barriers their more privileged peers did not encounter? But if we made exceptions to our stated standards, how did we do so fairly and consistently? How did we distinguish between students who needed more support to succeed and students who were genuinely not prepared for or committed to their education? I asked Lauren to arrange for me to speak with David directly before we made any decisions about his scholarship status. She looked surprised by the request, perhaps concerned about the precedent it might set for me to become personally involved in individual student cases when we were supporting nearly 150 students across the country. I know it is not scalable for me to personally intervene in every student's challenges, I acknowledged. But we are still in the early stages of developing our policies and approaches. I want to understand directly what is happening with David before we make decisions that will set precedents for how we handle similar situations in the future. This is an opportunity to learn what our students actually need rather than what we assume they need. Lauren arranged a video call with David for later that week. When his face appeared on my screen, I was struck by how young he looked, how exhausted and anxious. He was clearly surprised and intimidated to be speaking with me directly, apparently having expected a conversation with program staff rather than the foundation's founder and president. David, thank you for taking time to talk with me. I began trying to put him at ease. I want to understand what is happening with your academic performance this semester, and how we might be able to support you more effectively. Can you tell me about your experience so far at school? He hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to be honest or to present the kind of positive front that he might believe I wanted to hear. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and strained. I am failing because I cannot focus. I sit in lectures and my mind just goes blank. I try to read the assigned material and I cannot retain anything. I know I should be grateful for this opportunity. I know how many people would want to be in my position, and I am failing anyway. I do not know what is wrong with me. The self-blame in his statement was painful to hear. The assumption that his struggles represented personal failure rather than a response to overwhelming circumstances. David, it sounds like you might be dealing with anxiety or depression. Have you considered speaking with a counselor at the University Health Center? He shook his head immediately. My parents would be so ashamed if they knew I was considering therapy. In their understanding, mental health treatment is for people who are crazy or weak. They sacrificed everything to give me this opportunity. How can I tell them that I am so weak I cannot handle the pressure? How can I waste their sacrifice by failing? His words revealed the particular bind that many first-generation students found themselves in, caught between the expectations and cultural frameworks of their families and the realities of navigating elite educational environments that operated according to very different assumptions and norms. The pressure to succeed was not merely personal ambition but family obligation, and the shame of struggling felt like betrayal of enormous sacrifices made on their behalf. What if I told you that experiencing anxiety or depression in response to significant life transitions and pressure is extremely common, has nothing to do with weakness, and is very treatable? I said gently. What if I told you that taking care of your mental health is not wasting your parents' sacrifice, but is actually ensuring that you can succeed in honoring it? Would that change how you think about seeking help? David's eyes filled with tears, and he looked away from the camera. I do not know. Maybe. It is hard to believe that when I feel like I am failing at the one thing I am supposed to be good at. I was always the smart kid, the one who would make it out, who would make my parents proud. Now I am at this incredible school with all these students who seem so confident and prepared. And I feel like I do not belong there at all. I feel like everyone is going to figure out that I am not actually smart enough to be there. The imposter syndrome he described was something I understood intimately from my own educational experience and something I heard repeatedly from the students our foundation supported. The psychological burden of feeling like you did not genuinely belong in spaces you had worked extraordinarily hard to access was a barrier that was rarely acknowledged, but was often more limiting than academic preparation or financial resources. We talked for nearly an hour, with me sharing some of my own experiences of feeling out of place in graduate school, of struggling with anxiety about whether I was genuinely qualified or had somehow slipped through admissions by mistake. I explained the concept of imposter syndrome, and how common it was, particularly among high-achieving students from backgrounds underrepresented in elite educational spaces. I suggested specific campus resources he could access and offered to connect him with a mentor through our program who had navigated similar challenges. By the end of the conversation, David seemed slightly less isolated in his struggle, though still clearly overwhelmed and uncertain about his path forward. I told him that we would not be terminating his scholarship based on one difficult semester, but that continuing support would be contingent on his accessing mental health services and engaging with the mentorship and academic support resources our program offered. After ending the call, I sat for a long time thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the limitations of our current approach. We had designed a program that removed financial barriers and provided mentorship, which was valuable and necessary. But we had not adequately anticipated or addressed the mental health challenges that many of our students would face, the particular pressures of being the first in their families to access elite education, or the cultural factors that might prevent students from seeking help even when it was available. I called a special meeting with Lauren and our program staff to discuss how we might develop more comprehensive mental health support as part of our standard offerings, rather than as a crisis response to individual student struggles. The conversation revealed that David's situation was not unique. Several other students were struggling in ways that suggested mental health issues, and our current approach of referring them to campus counseling services was proving inadequate given the stigma, cultural barriers, and simple overwhelm that prevented many students from actually accessing those services. Over the following weeks, we developed a partnership with a mental health organization that specialized in working with diverse student populations, creating a system where our scholarship recipients would have access to counseling specifically designed for first-generation college students and for young people navigating cultural transitions. We trained our mentors to recognize signs of mental health struggles and to have conversations that normalize seeking support rather than treating it as admission of weakness. The process of adapting our programming based on real student needs rather than on our initial assumptions was humbling, but ultimately made the foundation's work more effective and responsive. It reinforced my understanding that good intentions and adequate resources were not sufficient for meaningful impact. We needed ongoing learning, willingness to acknowledge limitations in our approach, and genuine responsiveness to the people we were trying to serve. In mid-November, Allison's article was published in the magazine with significant prominence and a cover image that showed me standing in the foundation offices surrounded by some of our scholarship recipients. The headline read, "From Betrayal to Purpose: How One Woman Transformed Inheritance into Opportunity." The article itself was lengthy and thoughtful, weaving together my personal story with detailed examination of the Foundation's work and broader discussion of educational inequity and effective philanthropy. Allison had clearly done extensive research, interviewing not just me but also several students, Lauren and other staff members, education policy experts, and even reaching out to Marcus for comment though he had declined to participate. The article presented my story with nuance and complexity, acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had led to my inheritance, while focusing primarily on what I was building, rather than on the drama of how I had received the resources to build it. The section about Marcus was brief and factual, noting simply that he had declined interview requests and including only this statement from his publicist: Mr. Castellano prefers to focus on his current business endeavors rather than relitigating past family matters. He wishes his former wife well in her philanthropic work. The measured tone of his response surprised me, suggesting either genuine growth or simply more sophisticated public relations strategy. Either way, it represented a significant shift from his earlier attempts to control the narrative by painting himself as victim and me as opportunist. The magazine article generated significant attention for the foundation, resulting in a surge of donations from individuals and corporations wanting to support our work, additional partnership proposals from universities and other educational organizations, and unfortunately also a new wave of media requests for interviews and appearances. The visibility was valuable for advancing the foundation's mission, but it also created pressure on my time and on our organizational capacity that required careful management. One unexpected consequence of the article's prominence was that I began receiving letters and emails from women who had experienced similar betrayals in their own marriages and who found meaning or inspiration in my story. Many of these communications were deeply personal, sharing intimate details of discovery, divorce, and the difficult work of rebuilding, after having one's fundamental understanding of their life and relationships shattered. Some of these women sought advice about how to protect themselves legally and financially during divorce. Others simply wanted to express that reading about my experience had helped them feel less alone in their own struggles. Still others were further along in their recovery and wanted to share what they had learned or how they had rebuilt their own lives after betrayal. I tried to respond personally to as many of these communications as possible, recognizing that doing so required time and emotional energy I could barely spare, but feeling obligated to honor the vulnerability people were showing in reaching out. These exchanges were often moving and occasionally draining, forcing me to revisit aspects of my own experience that I had largely processed and moved beyond. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.